Hey there, this is Troy Yamaguchi for Eclipse TCG, and welcome to our most recent Galactic Championship meta review. The Galactic Championship is just over 2 weeks away from this date, so this is about the time where I think most people's testing is really ramping up and where people start to lock in their decks and we begin to get actual representative information about what we'll see in the room at that event. I've been really trying to think about the game and play as much as I can ever since spoilers were first fully released. But, in the first couple of weeks of testing, it's very difficult to actually get a bead on what's good, what's bad, and what people are actually going to bring. But I actually think now that I understand the format decently well, there are a lot of question marks still in the air, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I have just one question. Are you ready? 2 weeks is a lot of time and also not a lot of time. And obviously, we can't just spend all day thinking playing Star Wars. So, in terms of your testing, I'm just curious, how are things going? Do you feel prepared? What questions do you have? I'll be talking about all the questions that I still have about the format, and how are those forming your analysis of what you expect for this tournament? I think we can get that conversation rolling, and I'm very interested to hear what other members of the community are thinking at the moment. Okay, so if you've been following these other meta reviews, kind of format description type things, the other one or two that we've put out have not been, in our tier list form. I think we didn't have the information at the time. But anyway, I keep harping on this idea that the issue with this GC tournament is that it is the first major event of the entire set release. Usually we have at least PQ information to go off of. That's really important because you can see what the field looks like in general and what like notable like skilled players in the past are opting to bring. So that really helps you conceptualize the format, what's good, what's bad. But we don't have any of that going into GC. It's very daunting for that to be the case. It's a tournament that really matters. It's the World Championships, and with that, we really have to make do with the information that we have. So this is the Karameta information. I've linked this site in the past. This just gives raw play rate for the various decks that people are playing online. There are a lot of numbers to go through. This site also gets a little bit wonky sometimes, so I'm going to try to walk through what's happening recently and how that's been forming my opinions of the format. I always, of course, recommend that people check out these stats websites by themselves. There's a lot more that you can get when you can actually trundle the data yourself and make your view look how exactly you want it. But just for a shortcut, I can explain what I'm thinking right now and how that's shaping some of the questions I have about the format. In terms of what's seeing play, even still, just most recently as yesterday, Cad Bane Blue is still the most played deck, followed by Mandalorian Control, and then just like a wide range of like 3%, 4% type decks. Star Wars Unlimited is a very wide metagame, but something that's very cool about this website, and something that kind of teaches me about this game in general, is just this like chunking graph here on the right, this pie chart where it organizes decks by their colors as opposed to just leader base pair, is actually really, really similar to what you would see in a different card game, right? You see this like red, blue villain, blue, green hero kind of section of decks, these categories of decks that you could kind of clump all together. These comprise about half to 40% of the meta. That's very, very typical for like tier one strategies and other decks. And then, of course, this is just color. This says nothing about just like space aggro strategies all clumped together. So something that's really important to me in my metagame thinking is the clumping of archetypes and how, we see a bunch of like 3 and 4% decks, but when you put them all together, you actually get something that is, a really big metagame force, and that's what provides structure to the metagame. So, check out Karameta yourself. I'm not going to give, too much of like the nitty gritty on these stats. Number one, they're going to change within the next 1 or 2 weeks. And number two, this information is out there. That's not where like the analysis is important. But just in terms of strategies, I want to talk about the major archetypes that I think are defining what the Galactic Championship is going to end up looking like. Play rate issues that have been coming up in the past couple of weeks. Cad Bane Blue is actually on a downtrend. If we look at this graph, the Cad Bane is this like kind of purple line at the top. It's actually, ebbing and flowing a little bit down over the past couple of weeks. And I have my theories for why this is the case, and I'll be sure to enumerate those once we get to the tier list section. Luke 8 Data Vault is also downtrending. I think this deck was never very good. This was kind of just new toy syndrome. It's a cool leader. It's a big leader. It costs a lot. Like, that I think was the nature of that deck's performance. And then in terms of decks that are uptrending in the past week, especially, this Mandalorian control deck is really much on the rise. I'll be sure to talk, in pretty great depth about my opinions on that deck. I think that deck's really cool. It's really interesting, and it puts certain restrictions on the format that are very like binary. So that deck's a very notable metagame threat. And then pilot decks, space decks in general, I actually have seen a very, very big uptick in exactly the last week. And I think part of that is that a lot of people are just like jumping into the testing right now. These are people that are going to be attending GC. Maybe it's LCQ, maybe it's just, they're hopping in right now in terms of testing. And this is a place where a lot of people start. And like, even just beyond that factor, I think the pilot decks and the space decks in general are actually very, they continue to be very well positioned. They continue to be high floor and even like, reasonable ceiling decks. So I think these decks are actually pretty well positioned, and I'll be sure to talk about that in just a bit. Okay, I want to give an update on the last video I made, which was Pillars of the Meta, just to continue that continuity. For those of you who have tuned into those, I talked about kind of the three newer types of strategies that people were trying out at the moment, starting with the red-blue villain mid-range Cad Bane blue strategy, Ezra, and some of these like taller mid-range decks in Leia and Krennic. Okay, I have quite a bit of new understanding of these decks now that I've played them all a bit more. I am much, much less emphatic about Cad Bane's position as like the number one deck to be playing right now. So many reasons for this. A lot of matchup kind of futziness is occurring. And in general, some of the concerns I've expressed in the past with this deck's ability to, encompass the entire format in its deck list are coming up. It's very, very difficult to build your deck, not only for the mirror, for these other like bigger mid-range decks. You want to play a lot of bombs, you want to play things like SRI, but then you also need to beat the pilot decks that are coming up, the space aggro decks that are coming up, which makes you need to play little stuff. You need to play more upgrade removal. There's a lot more, targeted hatred for your deck. So like Leppy, look out the 3/1 shielded. You really want now system shock in your deck list somewhere. So a lot of problems for Cad Bane blue. I'll talk about those a little bit more when I get into the deck specific analysis. A pretty big update in my thinking so far for the Pillars of Meta. This Ezra yellow deck is, I think, rather fraudulent. I don't think this deck does anything particularly special or powerful. It's just a play guys on curve and then hope your leader gets you there type of thing. Like, you are one of the more powerful leader flips on 5. It's very relevant that a lot of leaders that are good now are flipping on 6 and even 7. Everything has kind of just like gone up one in the curve. But, the more I play this game, the more the decks are refined, the more decks are now prepared for Ezra. I don't think this deck's ceiling is all that. I don't think its floor is particularly impressive as well. This deck has, in my opinion, like kind of fallen off, and I would not expect it to do very well at GC. If you've been playing this deck a lot, if you're kind of indexed into it, don't worry, I'll talk a little bit about where I think some of its meta share will end up shifting and some of the, like, in my opinion, better approaches to the format, but not very high on this Ezra deck, and like, people are packing more upgrade removal, so your game plan of just making the Giga Ezra is, I think, not a very real way to play the game right now in this format. And then finally, like the superior value, like bigger mid-range ideas of the blue-green hero, blue-green villain. These decks continue to be like pretty okay. Like, of the 3 pillars that I discussed, these are like mostly intact. I kind of like sustain my opinions about both Leia and Krennic, about how Leia is kind of just like a bulk slot kind of board, stats deck. Like, also doesn't do anything super impressive, but I think it's a little bit better positioned than I think blue-green hero in general is just like a pretty fine archetype to be playing. And then this kind of deck, I sustain my opinions about this deck as well, of it's like rather powerful, but you are like almost completely beholden to the quality of your draws, which like is okay, because if you can build a good deck, like you should always draw, functional. But I think this deck more so than most is just like sometimes your ceiling is massive, and then like sometimes your deck doesn't do anything and it dies. So a lot of question marks on this Krennic deck. I prefer builds of it built a little more normally. I don't like indexing too much onto the like Enoch meme, because you play Enoch and then like your opponent has a brain and interacts with it, and then you lose the game. It doesn't feel very good. Finally, kind of the most important new development in the pillars. So this superior value idea of like, if Cad Bane's defining the format, we want a deck that accrues more value and is just, greedier than Cad Bane. That deck has emerged. That deck is the Mandalorian control. This deck is rather busted. I was incredibly skeptical of this deck when I first encountered it. It's part of the bias of me personally. I don't like the control decks that have existed in this game. I've never thought they're very good. This deck is legit. I do think this deck is a very, very, very real threat at GC. I think a lot of people are playing it. You saw in the earlier just stats overview, this was the, I think, second most played deck online at the moment. I mean, this deck is doing quite a bit, and I think will impose some very real conditions on the GC. So that's what we're going to talk about today. These are the pillars of the metagame. You know, when we talk about clumping archetypes together, I think these five just like genres of deck are going to be encompassing like most of the relevant metagame. These are all like valid strategies. They're all pretty strong, and they all have like different matchups into one another. And figuring out where you want to situate yourself is just a matter of, you know, what kind of style of deck do you like? What kind of bad matchups are you willing to take? What of the problems with these decks are more solvable than others? And I think this is kind of, you know, I have not been able to find a deck that I thought is just head and shoulders above the rest of them. Every deck has its own issues right now, and I think part of that is just because the meta hasn't been like quote unquote solved yet. But like even beyond that, I think this GC meta seems to be pretty well balanced. I'm interested to see how this tournament all chalks out. So in terms of your options, you have the red-blue villain archetype of decks represented here by Cad Bane Blue. I think that'll be the most common of them, but you also have the Talzin Red and Maul Blue like force strategies doing a pretty similar thing of having board control tools, controlling the ground pretty well, and, you know, mid-ranging your opponent out of the game now with their crazy bombs in the form of Pre-Vizsla. Very, very like solid, like normal human being swoo kind of mid-range idea. I think this deck is good. However, this deck has a very real new problem in the form of the Mandalorian control deck. You have burn damage in this color, so it's not a doomed matchup by any means. And because the Pre-Vizsla like bombs of this deck are so capable at removing the Mandalorian's board, the Mandalorian deck actually has to play like back and forth with you for like very, very long. I mean, the red-blue villain like mid-range deck can play a very, very long game. So it's not an intractable problem, I don't think, but I think this matchup is pretty weak for the red-blue villain archetype. I think it's one of the big reasons that Cad Bane Blue is seeing a downtrend. I still expect it to be a very relevant deck at GC. I still even expect it to probably be the most played deck, but that's its issue right now as it's situated. And you can put the devs and PBs in your deck. I think you still struggle with this matchup. There's very, very, very kind of like interesting back and forth happening with this matchup. So the Mandalorian control, this deck is rather busted. It bullies a lot of other decks out of the format. So something like the Ezra, if they just try to, you know, duck off to space and avoid you, the Mandalorian has Harrison Dula, the 3-cost 3/4 that restores damage equal to the damage that it hits the base. That card's crazy. So you can't just like straight ignore the Mandalorian deck. They have like enough restore to stay in the game, and then the amount of just raw card advantage they accrue is enough to drown most other mid-range decks. So this deck is very good. However, it has some like incredibly like problematic matchups. So like the wide, like anything that like goes wide in an aggressive fashion is really difficult for this deck to control. You know, Let's Call It War like helps prune their board and like manage it a little bit, but something like a Vader, like I think they can just eat the Let's Call It War. You know, I've played this matchup just a couple of times from both sides, and like they have like the 2/2 shielded is the Mandalorian just like doesn't have an answer for that really. And then even if they have to go like one drop and get their board pruned by Let's Call It War, it's still like problematic when they just refill their board next turn. You have to draw like yet another answer. It really stresses you to have like specific answers to their stuff. So that's a big problem for the Mandalorian. In addition, the blue-green hero archetype, just like having Kelleran, like all of the various blue-green hero decks have a pretty good matchup into the Mandalorian. And even something like blue-green villain can have certain curves to just like, you know, keep putting out threats, stay ahead, and never let the Mandalorian quite stabilize. So this deck's very, very good. It's incredibly powerful. It draws a ton of cards, which makes it very consistent, but some of its matchup problems, just because what it's doing is so like wonky and off the wall, very, very hard to solve. And that's, I think, its weakness going into this GC format. So we'll have to see like how the Mandalorian is adapting to the format. I'm not 100% sure it can solve its problems, but this is a deck that's incredibly difficult to build. It's very techy. It's a control deck. You have to like every card in your deck matters, and then Like just even like something like deck count is very non-traditional for this deck typically. So Mandalorian, absolutely one of the more interesting decks on this list. I'm happy it exists in some way because it's, in my opinion, just like the only good control deck that has existed ever since like the Vader blue, Boba blue of set one, you know? This is like, in my opinion, by far the best control deck that this game has seen since those days, and like maybe even better than those. I think this deck is very legitimate. Okay, that's enough glaze for the Mandalorian. Let's talk about another Mandalorian. This is Boba Fett Space. You know, the pilot decks are, in my opinion, like better positioned than usual. Part of that is because this is the first major event of the tournament, you know? Um, but also just like there are so many other valid strategies to be worrying about that are doing things very, very different from one another that I think space continues to get advantage into it by just being like the fifth thing you have to be scared of. This deck will be played at GC, of course. Like all of the space aggro decks are just like your go-to aggressive, like high floor type decks. I would expect this to be prepared for at GC. Like, if you're going to the World Championship, there's no way you don't like at least consider the fact that space is a real threat. But I think a lot of the emphasis right now is on like the mid-range decks, the Cad Bane Blue control. Like, if you look at everything else on this list, everything is like fairly value-based as opposed to aggressive. Like Cad Bane is, control is, and both the blue-green villain and blue-green hero decks are like, you know, just like board control slop decks. So in terms of an aggressive choice, the space and pilot decks are very, very powerful, I think, and rather well positioned as like a major pillar of the format. Okay, that's enough of that. Blue-green villain, this archetype I'm not very high on. I think a lot of its like current favor is attached to the idea of blue-green villain as it existed in the past in the form of like Kira, which was a good deck, and like Kylo Data Vault, which was a good deck, you know. Um, Blue-green villain as it exists post-rotation is not like those decks at all. You lost all of your like turnaround cards. You lost the ambushers and you know Vader and Maul. You lost Barrage really importantly, and really really relevant. You even lost like Super Laser Blast, right? Being in color. So all of these things together mean that when blue-green villain is behind, which it is frequently, especially against Cad Bane Blue and like the other like slightly more efficient mid-range decks, this deck lost a ton of its ability to turn the game around and like seize control back of the board. Like the green villain bombs are not very good. Like Ravager is a really, really good card in a different metagame. Like if there were more threats in space that it could kill, that card would be busted. But all of the good bombs are on the ground right now. Like Ninth Sister, you need to kill. Pre-Vizsla and the Mandalorian, like Token it leaves left of. Like those are the cards you need to kill. And the green bombs just like don't do that. Like Ravager does not touch those cards. It only hits like, you know, Devastator. It's like a good answer to, you know, Lawbringer. It's a good answer to. But outside of those bombs, which are not like currently being favored by the popular decks in the meta, the Ravager does not address much of substance. So that's problem number one. And like Trask Walker, same thing. It like doesn't impact the board. That card is only good when you're at either even or ahead on board, which is not the position that blue-green villain is playing from very often. So lots of problems with this archetype in my opinion. I think it might need to play single reactor ignition just to like swing the blue-green, or sorry, the blue, a red-blue villain matchup. If it can do that, and if that's like what kind of solves that matchup for you, I think this archetype can be real. I think this Krennic deck is doing something like pretty good. It's like ignorant, like ramp out something huge game plan is a little bit inconsistent for my liking, but when it pops off, like it is incredibly scary for you to just like dump out a pre-Vizsla or like, you know, even like double ramp into flip Krennic and then shoot you with my resupply carrier. Like that's a pretty decent turn. Have all 7 mana up, play Chimera, you know, sack the resupply carrier. Like these are all, this is a good play pattern that this deck is doing. I think this Krennic deck is better than the other blue-green villain decks. I think it does something more powerful. But it really has to solve its like lack of comeback potential problem. So that's where this deck is positioned. Also has problems into space. You know, it's a very passive deck. You're very reliant on specific curves of like double ramp into hyperspace disaster or double ramp into pre-Vizsla, you know. So kind of some positional issues with blue-green villain. In addition, like its control matchup is a problem it needs to solve, you know, like it's difficult for you to generate the aggression. Like when I said earlier that there are specific curves that allow you to do that, like they are rather specific. Again, it's like mostly like double ramp, hit them with my Krennic, hit them with my, you know, resupply carrier, and they can't deal with both units at the same time because it's the Mandalorian. Like he doesn't do that very well, you know, it's things like that. So that's blue-green villain in a nutshell. I think this deck's viable. I think it will be played. I think it perhaps will be overplayed in my opinion, but that's just because I personally am not high on this archetype. Okay, that's all that. Finally, let's talk about blue-green hero a little bit. This is an archetype where the decks that are being played are, in my opinion, like not very representative of what's good. Luke Data Vault, like the new Luke 8 Data Vault, continues to be like one of the higher played blue-green hero decks. That, in my opinion, is new toy syndrome. That boy is not very good. He's good in a different format where both sides are ignoring each other and you're able to flip on 7 and just like use the rest of your board to kill them and not die at the same time. But that's not the format we're in. We're in a board control format. And even though Luke's day-to-day ability is like actually like better than it reads just because it helps shrug off like the Cad Bane ping and stuff, it's not nearly as good as either Leia or Ahsoka. I think if you're looking in the blue-green hero world, both of those decks are way better than Luke Data Vault. I do not expect Luke Data Vault to be played very much at GC, but Ahsoka and Leia are both like very, very valid decks. They do similar things of just like they get more value out of their board than your opponent. The only difference is that Ahsoka has a cool flip turn and Leia has a leader that is fairly difficult to interact with, and just the ability to continue to pump up its little dudes to shrug off some of the board control wars that are occurring. So this blue-green hero deck is very good. I think it's has question marks into space. Space can be a little bit questionable just because your deck is a little bit slow and Topple is quite a scary card. Mandalorian is a good matchup for this deck. Cad Bane is, it's just a mid-range fight. I think you go toe-to-toe with that deck pretty well. And then blue-green villain can be suspicious because their the blue-green hero bombs are not very good. Like the only good card at 7+ is Kelleran, whereas blue-green villain has the Vizslas, the I guess Ravager's not very good. It's really just Pre-Vizsla. It's the only good card they own. But that card's, rather imposing. So that's about where this deck is situated. I think it's a great choice as well. Everything on this list I would see as a valid choice for GC. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly where I think they're positioned in terms of relative strength, given the general matchup nuances that I've tried to discuss just now. Okay, before we get to that, I want to talk about what we're going to be going over in our Metafy community this week. Pretty important, this is all about Premier. You have to remember the GC starts with a drafting limited tournament. You have 3 rounds of draft, and if you owe through the draft, you're basically out of the tournament. So we're going to be having a drafting strategy town hall run by sector champion Tyler York. He's been in charge with preparing us for our limited events this past month. And he has a lot of thoughts on just, how you go about choosing, your different cards, your colors, how to read signals. Very, very informational as always. And I highly, highly recommend you tune in. This Friday, we'll also be having testing VODs with a previous GC top 8 competitor, Joshua Everly. We'll just be going over some of these decks that we discussed this week. I mentioned all of like the different problems that decks have. When you're evaluating an archetype strength in a metagame, you just have to ask yourself, what problems am I willing to have? What problems can I think I solve? And how does that inform like what the least bad choice is a lot of the time? Do I pick the Mandalorian because I think this deck is powerful and I just like say, you know what, I'm fine giving up the matchups that I consider unwinnable? Or do I pick something like the Cad Bane Blue and say, well, the problems that this deck has are a little bit more even and therefore I like this a little bit more. So we'll be focusing specifically on the matchup questions that I'll discuss in this video in those testing VODs and giving actual gameplay, commentary, analysis live at that time. Okay. In addition to all this, we'll be having a bonus meta talk on Saturday with, some of the developments from this week. I'll go into even more depth with what I'm talking about today in terms of where I think the metagame is positioned. This will be available to all of our Metafy subscribers, even from the silver $10 tier up. I just want to make sure that I answer the questions that people have in the meta, and if people are still having difficulty choosing decks, I want to be able to talk just a little bit more specificity about where these things are situated, and this will be occurring this Saturday. Okay, so that's our Metafy calendar for this week. Let's get into the tier list. So quite a bit of ground to cover. This is the first tier list we've made for this GC, and like I said, I feel pretty confident about where things land on here. Of course, at this tournament, we'll see, the proof's in the pudding, and I do expect things to shift around based on what ends up being like optimized in the end. But as for right now, this is what I would be thinking of in terms of decks that I am like quote unquote afraid of. So let's start with the obvious choice, the elephant in the room, Cad Bane Blue. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that I am kind of lower on this deck than I was in the past, or I have additional questions for this deck. And the reason for this is I had very high hopes for this Cad Bane Blue deck. I played this deck expecting Hantu Blue from last GC. It's the same colors. It's a similar strategy of board control, and like my leader resembles Grogu. Like these are all good traits. This is not what I have found in playing Cad Bane Blue since then, and I think the issue with it is a board controlled deck, but the bodies that it puts left over on its board are virtually irrelevant. Something like a Marok, something like the Tie Dagger that gets left behind, even like the IG in space, like these bodies do not make an imposing board, and this deck does not necessarily play to like these overwhelmingly suffocating board states that Han 2 Blue did. And even on top of that, it has nothing like supremely unfair in the form of Force Throw and, something like a Luke Skywalker or a Crate Dragon, these cards that just say, when I play these, if I have any advantage whatsoever, I win the game and, you're never coming back. The closest thing that Cad Bane has to these things come online on 7 and 8, Pre-Vizsla is a crazy card. Chimera especially is, in my opinion, like the most unfair and broken card in this deck, but the issue with Cad Bane Blue is that Chimera is not very good in a format defined by Cad Bane Blue. It's not good in the mirror. It's not very good in the blue-green villain fight because it's, not, there's no card advantage. You have to kill one of your own units. You need a board presence for it to be live, and it trims your own board too. So, in a format where this deck could just be like a Chimera deck and the format was almost exclusively like other aggressive decks, this would be bar none like the best strategy to be playing just because Chimera is such a house. But that's not the format we live in whatsoever. And I think that this deck's difficulty in like performing all of these metagame roles and at the same time like fending off the space aggression, having to also now compete with the Mandalorian, like there's a lot of pressure being put on this Cad Bane Blue as kind of like a fair mid-range deck to be the number one choice in the format. And in my opinion, like it's almost like the juice is not worth the squeeze. This deck is really, really good. Like, do not get me wrong. If you've put a lot of time into this deck, and if this is a deck that you think is, well positioned going into this tournament, like this is not a bad pick by any means. But I just want to point out that this deck is a lot more mortal than other like decks in this style have been in the past. That's like my current theory on Cad Bane Blue. I'm not personally very excited to play this deck at GC. It's a definite like consideration for me. I think if it continues to answer its questions in the next 2 weeks, it could be a valid choice, but it's not screaming to me right now that this is the right thing to be playing. Just based on all of it that I've tried. Like, matchups are a struggle and it's a lot happening. So that's my opinion on Cad Bane Blue. I don't want to like undersell or like sandbag this deck. It's still very good, but just I think in a format where people have had time to adjust to it, it has much bigger difficulties than I was expecting, given the like just like naked strength of the deck when it's a field where nobody is prepared for it whatsoever. Like sure, it just steamrolls in that context, but that's not the world that we live in anymore. So those are my concerns with Cad Bane Blue. Nonetheless, as I keep saying, I don't want to undersell this deck. It's still very powerful, very good. It's still a very good choice, and I still would expect it to be the number one choice at GC for the majority of players. So it's defining the format, but I do not expect it to be to the level of Han 2 Blue was last year at GC, which is the most like obvious comparison. Okay, so that's Cad Bane Blue. On the other hand, let's talk about almost the complete opposite deck, which is the Mandalorian Control. If Cad Bane Blue is this kind of like middle ball of like 55% win rate type of decks, this Mandalorian deck is like one of the most powerful things you can be doing in this format. Absolutely. I talked about some of its matchup issues in our pillars sections. Let me just try to say what my thesis on this Mandalorian deck is. Number one, drawing 3 cards a turn is just obviously bonkers. Like it makes your resourcing decisions so easy. It makes your deck so much more consistent just because of the sheer volume of cards you see. You will always have a good answer in your hand if your deck is built, quote unquote, well. But the issue that this Mandalorian deck brings is this is a really kind of like a fascinating deck. As far as control decks go, as I said in our pillars section, like I think this is the best control deck that has existed in the game probably since set one and maybe in history. But this deck is like really neat in the sense of you have like very, very interesting deck building questions. Like number one, how am I developing my curve? You always want to leave the one up to draw if possible. So that's like the first question. Number two, how much deck ante am I willing to bring to the mirror match? And do I even need a deck ante? So in the past, control matchups have almost always gone to mill just because the quality of their removal was so good and their ability to generate aggression was so low. The difference with the Mandalorian deck, and on the basis of that, like you would want to play a higher deck count in certain times to account for the possibility that you would be milled out. So there's a very real case for this deck to go above 50, above the minimum deck size, and it can accommodate that just because it sees so much of your deck, and you can just put like more just removal slop in your deck, and like it'll work out fine. The issue with this Mandalorian deck is that as far as a control deck, it's really weird. Its board wipe does not come online until at least 9, but more typically 10, right? Because you could play Nebula Ignition, but more frequently they just play, the single reactor ignition. Its board wipe doesn't come online until very, very late, and it actually does struggle to remove just multiple units per turn, right? Because you don't have the very strong, 2-for-1 type of cards. You just have like bulk targeted removal, like Charged with Treason and like True Remembers and junk like that. You have speed bump Sentinels that you can play out because you draw 5 million cards. You don't really care if your units die. You just need to let the game be prolonged. And then you have like the targeted removal, which is rather strong, which is like Hammerhead and something like the Anakin. And like eventually you can stick a Bo-Katan, but that doesn't come online until 9. So this deck struggles to remove multiple cards. You don't have like the Barrage that Blue-Green Villain had in the past. You don't have, the Laser Blast that comes online at 8. So the question of if this matchup always goes to mill is interesting. Like, and finally, like the most important thing is that this deck does burst damage, which control decks don't do in the past. So at some point, almost every single unit that untaps is going to represent a lethal threat with aggressive negotiations. So this is a matchup where the mirror is very much still in question for me, and figuring out how that will be played will really determine like what this deck should look like as it's built and some of its power in the format. Because if you can afford to have less like deck ante in the mirror in terms of like going above the minimum deck size, your deck will be far more consistent, and it'll be very, very easy for you to just like put silver bullets for the format, find them, draw them, and run through people. So I talked about this deck's weaknesses in the archetype sections. I think it also has a number of great strengths. I think it's very, very difficult to build this deck, not to mention that there are like in tournament play issues in terms of like you need to make sure that you know exactly what's up. You will have 20 cards in your hand at any one time. You have to play the game for a very long time. You don't want draws. A draw is basically a loss at this tournament, so you have to make sure your pace of play is really high. There's a lot of like futziness occurring with this Mandalorian deck that I think will make it underrepresented at this tournament relative to its strength. But I think if someone can perfect the deck list, I mean, if someone solves this deck's like quote unquote intractable problems, I will just bar none play this deck. This deck is busted, but I think the matchup problems are not quite solvable. The tournament futziness and the decklist problems are solvable. Those are just like player skill, considerations. So a lot of good things happening with this Mandalorian deck. Don't know if its metagame position will allow it to make the deep run and win as its power level might otherwise suggest. I also think that it is a known like boogeyman right now, and players in Star Wars just hate losing to and playing against control. So those are like other factors that like kind of don't excite me too much about taking this Mandalorian deck. But just looking at these two like top 1-2 picks that I've got right here between Mandalorian and Cad Bane Blue, I'm kind of higher on the Mandalorian. This deck is doing something pretty cool, which is the burden of me saying that. Let me just like be fully transparent. Is not low. I don't like control. I've never liked control in this game. Dijamiro was like a minimally acceptable quality strategy. Every other control deck has been like mostly crap since, the Vader and Boba Blues of the world, like the Item Verso control deck, that deck sucked. Just so many bad control decks people have tried to force just because it's a major archetype of card games. But this deck's the real deal. This deck's very powerful. If you like control, like congratulations, there's a good one now. Like a lot positive things happening here, at least for this Mandalorian deck. But metagame issues and technical futzy play issues are occurring as well. So that's my thesis on the Mandalorian. Don't want to ramble too much about him, but I think it's really important. I think this deck is imposing quite a number of restrictions on the format as to what makes a quality strategy. Really, really must be considered. Okay, those are the top 1-2 decks. Outside of that, comprising the remainder of tier 1, after a power gap, I have both the pilot leaders Boba Fett and Darth Vader. I think these decks are very, very like good and acceptable. I think Boba Fett is a little actually like weaker than Darth Vader. I think it'll be more represented just because as a holdover from its strong position in the previous format, Boba Fett Lake Country is like still a pretty good deck to be playing. The Darth Vader deck, I actually am relatively high on, again, which is not normal. This GC format's very, very strange. Many bizarre changes are occurring in my brain, but this Vader deck is rather well positioned in my opinion. It runs over the format because of Cad Bane Blue has kind of like went up into like these bigger mid-range ideas. I mean, if you think of like the other 4 major decks in the format, okay, Cad Bane Blue is a big mid-range deck. Mandalorian Control is a control deck, but like it wants to stick units and like eventually just becomes also like a big mid-range deck where it's just, you know, playing a unit that kills your unit and then hitting your base with it, you know, and then eventually just clicks Ag Neg and you take 20 in one hit, which is like super cool. So those 2 decks, all right, Blue-Green Villain, that is a big mid-range deck, not a control deck, big mid-range deck. Blue-Green Hero, big mid-range deck. So you have all of these kind of like bigger, slower, you know, higher curve mid-range decks. Darth Vader goes under those decks quite well, you know. The aggression it generates just from being able to double drop is quite a lot of velocity. As I mentioned, like the Mandalorian can, you know, prune your board with Let's Call It War, but you have ships that don't die to Let's Call It War, and when you're able to generate tokens and go mega wide, they really, really struggle with that. Krennic, same deal. Kind of a slow deck, not doing anything very impactful for the first 2 turns, right? Just trying to ramp out and scam you, basically. And so Vader's ability to just, you know, generate velocity and put out crazy, crazy threats is very, very much like called for in this format. I think this deck is rather, rather good. It's a competitor with Boba Fett. The issues with Vader is, again, you just have some matchups that you cannot win. Its Luke Skywalker matchup in particular is crap. It's really, really bad. Even something lower on the tier list like Ezra is a little bit suspicious often. Like they have the green leader, like the 3/1 that when it dies pings a unit for 2, and then they also have like quality spaceships in their deck. So some bad things can happen to you if you play Vader. And it's also just like a deck that is easily invalidated by your opponent when they choose to respect and prepare for it. But as I keep mentioning in this format, quite a number of decks to be afraid of. And in terms of like Vader's position at this moment, I think higher than he tends to be. I'm actually like medium high on this guy. Okay, so those are the tier 1 decks. I think, you know, space is always a difficult call to make just because you don't have quite as much control over the game as you would prefer. But in terms of just a strong baseline strategy, you know, space will be in the room. I expect space to perform. Space will probably top this event. Like this deck will be around. It will be, you know, a powerful thing to be playing. Like I would be surprised if there was no space represented at all in Top Cut and like the upper echelons of this tournament. So I need to give this deck its flowers, and I need to emphasize to people not to index too much on the like value board control type game that Cad Bane is creating. There are other decks in the room as well. So that's tier 1. All those decks are good. Tier 2, I think this is a metagame where the distinction between tier 1 decks and tier 2 decks is very, very low, if existent whatsoever. All of these decks are fairly well positioned into one another's and all have their own like very real problems. The Blue-Green Villain world, the Krennics of the world, as I mentioned in the archetype section, has issues with the more efficient mid-range decks. You know, the Red-Blue Villain deck is sometimes difficult, and that is a problem that needs to be solved in deck building. And as I just continue to mention, I'm not a huge fan on how draw-reliant Krennic feels, but as for the blue-green villain strategies, he is very powerful. You have other like fringe blue-green villain strategies that could see play. Towsing Green is a rather strong deck. It actually deals with space better than you would think, just because your ability to tempo through their board is pretty good. You have a lot of equips that are very good in her colors. I say a lot of equips. It's really just the Darksaber and like, you know, Craving Power, but that's all you need. And you have Constructed Lightsaber in the mix as well. But the Towsing Green like exemplifies its weakness of its archetype, where it does far worse into Cad Bane Blue than something like the Krennic. So Cad Bane continuing to impose restrictions on the format. And again, your Mandalorian problem is a little bit difficult. You need to hit a kind of specific curve of units, and it's difficult for your deck to generate the appropriate aggression and you don't just have the direct burn damage. Like, you could play Devastator and salvage out of aspect, but as I mentioned previously, like the Mandalorian deck is turning the corner faster and doing burst damage more than control decks tend to be. So if you're playing back, they're playing back, they might just sneak up and kill you. So some issues with Blue Green Villain. I think it's a fine strategy, though. It's not the one that I'm super excited to play, but it will be in the room. People like this deck, and people have holdovers from its glory days in the previous formats. Finally, Blue Green Hero, represented here by Ahsoka. The Ahsoka deck is really, really cool. It has a very powerful flip turn. It plays the mid, like a value game, like board slot well as well. I think Leia is a valid consideration, just doing all the same things. They're just like beat down ground aggro decks. They're very, very similar. Just do not play this Luke Data Vault guy. I don't think he's very good whatsoever. I mean, if you have a different thesis, like, actually I would like to hear it. But my opinion on the Luke Data Vault strategy in the Blue Green Hero world is that he would be very good at a format where everyone's just ignoring each other and racing. So like he might have upsides into space as compared to his other Blue Green hero friends, but I don't think that's the case. I think his leader flip comes online too slow, but I admit I've not like tested that matchup too extensively whatsoever. So that's my opinion on Blue Green Hero. I think this archetype is good. I think it has advantages into the Mandalorian and is like playable into Cad Bane. I don't know how much like further edge you have. I really need to see how this deck performs into space and like how the lane dodge situation is occurring there. I think that's like a bigger question for me for Blue Green Hero in general. And then after Power Grab, just like the other space deck that exists, Luke Data Vault is, in my opinion, not a very good deck whatsoever. I think playing out one card per turn when your cards are so piddly as the Luke fighters are is not exciting whatsoever. This deck didn't get very many new cards in the new set. It got the Admiral Akbar, which does solve a deck's problem with being able to help rebuild your number of fighters to flip Luke onto. That's pretty okay on 5 going into your flip turn, but outside of that, I don't think this deck is super well positioned. I don't think it's very good into either the Mandalorian or Cad Bane Blue. I mean, anything with hyperspace hoses this deck crazy, and it doesn't generate quite the velocity that Vader does to get around that. Boba Fett famously does not have a hyperspace problem because it converts into a burn deck. So, I mean, if you look at like everything above it in the tier list that's not in the space world, you will see that's a blue deck, that's a blue deck, that's a blue deck, and that's a blue deck. What do all these decks have in common? They can just opt to put hyperspace in their deck. I don't think Blue Green Hero will do that typically, but you know, they could. So Luke has more obstacles, and yeah, just the fact that Hammerhead exists in this Mandalorian strategy, you have a hard time beating that deck to death as well. Your win conditions against them are a little bit more narrow than Boba Fett, which has like real burn in it, and then Darth Vader, which has the ability to just go wide. So I don't like Luke whatsoever as compared to the other space decks. Its only like major advantage, as I've mentioned, is that if Darth Vader is well positioned given its ability to combat Mando, Luke farms that deck for free. Like the 3R turn, Vader's like looking at himself like, I don't know how I can win. That's like a good strategy, and the Luke deck is like, you know, fairly streamlined. I mean, it's just like 40 bulk fighters and some like decent removal events. It's not the worst thing to be playing. I don't see a strong thesis though for it to be very good. But it is like the kind of like last remaining deck on this list that I feel is like a strong pick, or like a deck that could like perform pretty well. Okay, let's go into Rogue. Of course, like Rogue is always very wide in this game. There are tons of like variant strategies of other decks on this tier list. Like I talked about red blue villain and like the possibility of like a Talisman red or a Maul blue, you know. So there are all sorts of variants of these decks that are included as well that I don't think are as like major as the ones that I've included and called out particularly. But the two decks that like don't fit into a particular archetype that I think bear mentioning are both the Ezra Yellow and the Cad Bane Yellow strategies. This Ezra Yellow deck, as I've kind of like rambled on about, is, in my opinion, like rather fraudulent. I don't think it has many metagame advantages, if any at all. It's just like a collection of 50 cards you could be playing that generate like naked aggression. Like I don't understand what makes this deck powerful anymore, because its leader is like, sure, like stapling stuff to Ezra is good, I guess, but I don't know. It's not very exciting to me. Given that other decks I think have stepped up and kind of like shown their niche in the meta and optimized themselves not to just like lose to playing a bulk 2 cost spaceship and then a bulk 3 cost spaceship and then a bulk 4 cost spaceship and then flipping your leader and like trying to assemble the Giga Ezra. So very very like low on this Ezra deck at the moment. I think this is like maybe the worst deck on this list, except for the flavor of the week, like fun, like meme deck of sorts. This Cad Bane yellow deck is interesting, not very good in my opinion, but there is like a thesis here that makes sense, which is if I just discard my opponent's entire hand, they can't play, which is true. The weakness of this approach in the past has been that you don't have board control because you're just spending all your resources like cringing your opponent's hand. But now that Cad Bane exists, you can say, in addition to just taking cards out of your hand for fun, my leader's Cad Bane and yours isn't. So that means I'm going to be able to pick away at your board and then like eventually accrue a board advantage when I take all the cards in your hand and then I take the cards off your board with like an IG at some point or a Justifier. Eventually, like the ninth sister will get involved, and like that is what the deck's actual like power play is of like I made your resourcing so miserable and your ability to keep real cards in hand so miserable, and now the ninth sister hits the board and number one, you don't have an answer to her. Number two, like I threw the only real card out of your hand and it blew up your entire board. So that thesis is like compelling. It's like almost a weird control deck of sorts. But as it turns out, discarding your opponent's entire hand is just like not really a real way to play the game. Like your opponent will still get to establish real bodies, and you're kind of just like building your strategy on a pile of prayers. So I don't think that I think this deck is more of a meme than like is good. I think this deck's like really overplayed right now, just as like the most recent like interesting thing. I think once I think this deck is a homework check, essentially is what it is. Like if you know what's up, if you play around their exhaust effects by swinging your dude first instead of taking a game action unnecessarily, using your lead ability unnecessarily or anything like that, it helps a lot. And then once you're able to just build a board without panicking that your whole hand is getting demolished, like the units that they're establishing don't do anything either. Like they're playing the 3/1, or they're playing like Admiral Ozzel, or they're playing a Battlefield Marine that also rips a card out of your hand. Like these are not imposing board threats. So when you're able to just retain anything, which you will, and put it on your board, you can usually just secure a board advantage that way and not worry too much about what this deck's doing. It ends up doing like kind of a little bit of nothing. So that's Cad Bane yellow. I think this deck, people will just play it because its play pattern is funny and like it feels good to just throw like the games that this deck wins. Like you feel like I didn't get to play the game, so it's rather demoralizing to lose to this deck. So I think this is a deck that you should prepare for, like acknowledge exists, and again, I think it's a little bit of a homework check. Are you familiar with the like what's up? Okay, so that's the tier list this week. In terms of what people are thinking about as they're beginning to lock in their deck choices, I think these are some of the various considerations that are going on. Of course, as we get closer to the GC, I'll continue to increase the specificity of my analysis as I learn more about the format. I think one thing I really want to do is just go through and break down like what all the different plus and minuses are in the individual decks, like within their archetype. So breaking down what differentiates a Krennic from an Aura Singh. But that's something that I want kind of like more specific play rate and matchup information on like closer to GC. So I just want to give like the general overview and the general structure for it at this time, kind of like at this like 2 week out juncture. So stay tuned for my continued metagame products. I will continue to make these as always. It's part of what I enjoy about the game. Okay, let's talk a little bit about my expectations for the GC in particular. And this is like completely vibes-based analysis. If this is like completely off, I would not be surprised. There's a lot of Star Wars to play in the next 2 weeks. So some of these will shift around, but just for what I'm thinking, like how I'm trying to consider like what I see as a viable or not viable strategy, or what problems I'm willing and not willing to have. Some general things. I do expect space to be like actually rather represented. This is the representation I expect at like day one, but as something like a last chance qualifier, I expect space to be like even more like rampant. It's very difficult to choose a deck at this format, and I feel like a lot of people are just gonna like, I just want to play space. Maybe that's like kind of like a naive assessment. That's like maybe underestimating people's mentality going into GC, where it's a very long tournament and you want like as much control over the game as possible, which really like incentivizes you to pick something like a more middle like Cad Bane idea. But just based on my like general assessment that space is actually like pretty well positioned in this format. I do expect it to be maybe in totality more represented than Cad Bane Blue. I would even like say that would be my belief like right now, especially just given my general like doubts about Cad Bane Blue. And its ability to stave off the rest of the meta. But that would be kind of like my strange call right now. Everything else I think is pretty like straightforward. Like Cad Bane Blue being like the most played leader base pair is like almost inevitable to me. I don't know the degree to which this will be. I expect it to be kind of like a little bit lower than in the past. It would not surprise me if Cad Bane Blue was like 11% instead of, you know, something like a 15 or something closer to 20. If Cad Bane Blue hit like an 11% type beat, and then the next leader base pair was something like an 8 or 9, and like, you know, running up on his heels very closely, that would be like a pretty acceptable outcome to me. But as for now, I would ascribe Cad Bane Blue like the number one leader base pair. But I think its margin might be a little bit lower than what's on screen right now. In terms of the other major archetypes, I think Blue Green Villain and Blue Green Hero will be about equally represented. I do expect their front runners to be just the ones that are currently number one online in the forms of Krennic for Blue Green Villain and Ahsoka for Blue Green Hero. People don't like to play this Leia deck very much just because it's not particularly exciting. I think the Leia deck is good, though. I think, if anything, the Leia deck will be underplayed at this event. But I have no control over the strategies that people bring. So that's my opinion on like both of those situations right now. And then like kind of the big question mark for me, and I keep bringing this guy up because I think his like position in this metagame is really important and really interesting. I don't know how many people will bring the Mandalorian sheerly off the basis of his like actual practical issues and the difficulty in getting a good deck list and the difficulty in like getting comfortable with the reps and like the difficulty in navigating tournament policy and like not drawing and all these sorts of things. Like these are all like, you know, in a wide meta where you have many options, these are things that make people just go, I don't want to play that deck, which I think is wrong. I think this deck will be, if anything, underplayed. I think this deck is quite powerful and is doing something really, really unique. So I have Mandalorian pretty low compared to its other peers in tier one, but I would not be surprised to actually see this be the second most played deck as compared to Cad Bane Blue, because in terms of raw power, I think it's definitely up there and is a really, really real threat at this event. So anyway, that's my assessment of the format. Again, it's completely vibes based, and this will change in the next 2 weeks, but that's what's informing my testing right now. It is more talks in terms of this tournament itself. This is a pretty difficult format to solve. You know, I've played a lot of SWU. I think about this game quite a bit. Nothing I've been able to find in terms of the decks are like head and shoulders above everything, and you know, everything seems pretty equal in power level, which is good. You know, you want a balanced format going into the metagame, but even something like the Hantu Blue from last year, you know, I did the entire circle. We started and we said like, oh, there's no way this Hantu Blue deck is the best thing to be doing, and like, lo and behold, like we made the full circle around and we came back to it, like, well, okay, there's nothing better. We'll just play this Hantu deck, and it ended up being fine. Cad Bane, I went on a similar journey. I started with Cad Bane Blue. I said, well, this deck's pretty good, and then played everything else, and then went back to Cad Bane Blue. And then once people kind of optimized the deck list, I went, oh man, this deck isn't quite as powerful as I thought. So based on that, at this point, I expected to kind of had found like what I thought the best deck would be is, but I've not quite gotten there yet. Of course, it's difficult because we don't have, as I keep harping, information on the format. The format will like prove itself once this tournament occurs. Like this happens every time. This is like the beautiful thing about metagame is like the proof is in the pudding, and then like if your prep is good, you will be rewarded. But of course, this doesn't help us right now as we're attempting to prepare to do well at this event. So as I keep saying, like this is like a difficult format to solve in that regard, and that's the purpose of like these various like discussions and like analytical products is, you know, by articulating my thoughts and by sharing them, putting them out there, I can, you know, try to advance the meta cycle and try to glean more information about the format. So anyway, I think that's where we are right now. Format's quite open, and you know, nothing so far has struck me as the best thing to be doing. In terms of performance, in terms of these archetypes that we've discussed today, as I keep saying, I am medium low on Cad Bane Blue for all the reasons I've discussed. Again, I need to just continue to emphasize because I don't want people getting after me for this. This deck's not bad. This deck's not trash. If you sleeve this deck up, you've made a responsible and like quality choice. But for all the reasons I've discussed, this deck has increasingly more questions than I think is probably appropriate for like a number one strategy, at least for me. So I want to continue to investigate how this deck is positioned and what some of the answers and responses are going to be. And then on the other side, you know, these two decks are like frequently, two sides of the same coin. This Mando deck is broken. Like, this Mando deck is quite powerful, but I just don't know if I can bring this to the tournament confidently, knowing that this deck has problems, knowing that people know that this deck is powerful and know that this deck is like, people will bring answers to this deck to this tournament. It's like irresponsible to think that they won't. So I don't feel very confident in saying, well, Mando's broken and like I'm just going to index all of my time into preparing Mando. Like, at this point, I don't think that's where the metagame is, although I do think that this Mando deck is a fine choice. It just depends on where the silver bullets are and if you just happen to get domed in the head with one. I think it's a pretty like scary thing for me to have that be my tournament fate. But that's what I understand about the format. I would love to tell you that I found the best deck, and just say like I figured it out. Like, good luck, guys. I'll see you at the GC. But that's not the world that we live in. As I say, like I would be on an island somewhere and not think about Star Wars. But that's not the world we live in. Quite interesting, pretty cool format, and I think we have just enough time to like answer all of these questions that we've discussed today confidently and like end up with a good list. I think 2 weeks is like it's like so much time and so little time. A lot of Star Wars to be played. Quite excited for this tournament. Okay, so that's the end of the video. Thank you as always for tuning in. I did want to announce, I don't know if this has been discussed anywhere else, but I couldn't even find like the FFG like announcement of this, but I will be one of the panelists at the Galactic Championship Compete panel. This is taking place on Friday at 1 p.m. I believe. I mean, that's what it was told to me at some point. So I'll be joined there with a number of other competitors whose faces you may know. So come check it out. Come ask questions, say hi, like all that good stuff. I'm happy to be on the panel. It's really exciting. Thank you as always. Metafy community exists. This is where the discussion always continues. Link is in the description. Thank you as always to our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next.